Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Lucchini Gambit, which is an extremely fun opening that's filled with tons of traps. So it starts out with e4, e5, and then f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, the pretty common Italian game. Bishop here to c5, and the most common move for white is to play pawn c3, preparing for pawn to d4. There's only three moves that are tied for second. We have the Evans Gambit, which is pawn to b4. We have castling on the king side. And then lastly, we have pawn to d3. And the Lucchini Gambit comes from this variation where white plays pawn to d3. So if you are playing this variation right here, bishop here to c5, the Gioco piano, it's always good to understand how you're going to respond because your opponent does have lots of options. But if they play pawn to d3, we have the Lucchini Gambit, and that is pawn to f5. Now there's a few variations that we are going to look at. The first one is knight to g5. You can see that this is preparing for the knight coming down to f7, forking this rook here and the queen. The bishop here on c4 is doing a good job of attacking the square here on f7. So that's going to be the most common line. This knight's also protected by the bishop here on c1, so it just makes logical sense. We also will look at if the bishop takes here on g8. We will also look at if white just decides to castle on the king side. So let's go and get into it and start with our first variation. The first variation we're going to look at is knight to g5, which makes a ton of sense. This knight's protected by the bishop here on c1. It can prepare to come down to f7, attack the queen, and this rook here on h8. But we're going to play pawn to f4, and there's two main reasons. One, it blocks off the dark square bishop from getting involved into the game, and also we want to play d5 at some point in a few variations, and that opens up for the light square bishop to not only get past the d pawn, as well as our f pawn right here. So f4 is a very, very important move in this variation. Now they play knight to f7, and then we play queen to h4, and this is the first trap because, hey, yeah, okay, you're attacking our queen and our rook. Sure, we have to move our queen, and now you can just take our rook, but then we actually win the game. Queen takes here on f2, and this is going to be checkmate. So they may recognize that it's a bad move. They're going to lose if they take our rook right here. They could castle on the king side. Since we're attacking with our queen and our bishop on f2, they could say, hey, let's castle. We have king protection. This rook here on f1 is protecting the pawn. So now they may actually feel pretty safe after we play the move knight to f6 that they can go ahead and take the rook here on h8. This is another trap because this is going to lose. We played knight to g4, and this is threatening again this pawn here on h2 for checkmate. Really, the only good option they have is to play h3, but then we could just play knight takes here on f2. After the rook takes, we're going to take here with our queen. And after they play king to h1, then we play the move pawn to f3. And they don't have a lot of good options. If they take with their queen here, okay, well, that's going to be checkmate. So that's not a really good option. Their other option is to just take with their pawn here. But then we play the move pawn to d5. This opens up for the light square bishop can come up here, take the pawn here on h3. This is going to be very, very bad for white. You can see there's just not a lot of great options that white has. Black also has the option of getting his knight up here to d4 if it wants to, and then can later come up here to e2 depending on where white goes. But all in all, this is going to be extremely good for black if white falls into that trap. Okay, so we come back a few moves after they castle on the king side. We play knight to f6. They don't have to fall for the trap here on h8. And that's completely fine. They could also try to blow up the center of the board. And one move to do that is d4. This does attack this bishop here on c5, putting a lot of pressure on the king side. So they could just decide, hey, let's not allow this. Let's go ahead and try to stop this. We're still going to play knight to g4. And it is slightly different after they play pawn to h3, but not too much because we're still going to play knight takes here on f2. They can't take with their king. It's protected by the queen. After the rook takes here on f2, then we play bishop takes on d4. And this rook is being pinned down. And so you can see that they're kind of in the same spot. Even though they thought they were protecting the middle of the board, it's not going to end well for them. So another trap they can fall into by trying to feel like they are controlling the center of the board. So that's all what happens if they castle on the king side. Not a lot of great options for them. Now, the better option for them in this position is to play pawn to g3. We're going to play queen to h3. And now let's go ahead and take a look at the trap again. They may decide, okay, well, yeah, you don't even have your knight here on f6, so things should be good. I don't really see a way. Your queen's not attacking this square here on f2, so should be clear for takeoff. Let's go ahead and take this rook here on h8. But now we play the move pawn to d5. Remember, we talked earlier about moving the f pawn as well as the d pawn to prepare for the light square bishop to get involved into the game. Now, they could take because, yeah, why not? Hey, this is a outpost here for the bishop, free pawn, but we have the move bishop here to g4, pretty much trapping this queen here on d1. We'll look at both options. They could play both f3 here. They could also play queen to d2 here, just to give you an idea of how they may actually respond. Let's look at f3 first. From here, we're going to go ahead and take the pawn on g3, which looks a little odd, but that's exactly how we are going to continue here. And then, sure, go ahead and take our bishop here on g4. And then we're going to play g2. Now, this is extremely important because the pawn can take this rook here on h1 and promote to a queen. Can also do the same thing if it comes here to f1, which would be even worse because then that new queen is protected by the queen. But if it comes here to g1, you can see that the bishop can just take here on g1. So white doesn't have a lot of good options. Now they could stall. You know, they could just take here on c6. Then we take here. It's just delaying the inevitable. They play rook to g1. We're going to take with our bishop here. Maybe queen to d2. Just trying to get another piece to help with the defense here. This knight here on h8's not doing anything. The rook here on a1's not doing anything. The knight here on b1, bishop here on c1 not doing anything. And chess is all about the amount of material you have involved in the attack. So the fact that we gave a rook up here on h8, it doesn't really matter because we have so much material attacking our opponent. So now we can take here on h2. Yeah, sure, maybe they're trying to get their queen involved into the game. And also this pawn here on g4 really stopped their queen from getting involved into the game. So when we gave up our bishop earlier in this position, right here, after we took here on g3 and they took it, really all this pawn is doing is stopping that queen from going anywhere in the game. So after queen to e3, well, we don't want to exchange off right away. Let's go ahead and take material right here. Maybe king to d2, and then we promote to a queen, and you can see this is going to be good game. Black is going to win this. So that's what happens if they play pawn to f3. That's definitely one option they have if they want to hold on to the queen. The other option is just queen to d2. From here, we can play knight to d4. And this is threatening a ton of options. One is just knight to f3. That's check, and also forking the queen here on d2. So they could decide now, okay, let's just go ahead and attack the king, because maybe you're always looking at this and saying like, hey, the knight's here on h8. It could do something. It's actually protecting the square here on f7 for the bishop to come to. But it doesn't really matter because black can just play king to d8 and that threat is stopped. Okay, so if they play pawn to c3, and yes, white has some options, but just to give you an idea of the threat level that black has, we don't even have to play here knight to f3 first. Instead, we can start to threaten mate here with queen to g2, preparing to take here on h1, and then now maybe rook to f1, and then knight to f3 for the check, and the fork here on queen to d2. So it doesn't really matter how they want to fall for the trap. There's just so many options we have to strike our opponent and make things difficult for them. So that's what happens if they try the variation where they just play g3 instead of castling on the king side. Now, after we move our pawn to f4, they don't have to play knight to f7. They could actually play bishop here to f7 and just say, hey, this bishop is protected by the knight, so let's do something here. But we're just going to play king to f8. Now, I think the best move from white is just to play pawn to h4. But then we can kick the knight away, and it would be a huge mistake if they just move their knight back, doesn't really matter where they could move it to, because then we just have a free piece right here. So that wouldn't be good for white. Instead, they probably just want to go ahead and take right here. So the bishop takes, and then after we take here with our pawn on g5, then they decide to bring their bishop back here to d5. Any other way, and either side is going to lose in that exchange here. But then we can take with our pawn here on h4, and you can see white has not done anything to develop the queen side of the board. The king side is wide open, so yes, we definitely pushed our f-pawn up the board, and our king is somewhat exposed, but they don't have a ton of material attacking us, and we're starting to push up on the king side of the board. We can put a lot of pressure on them. Now, let's say they play king to g4, can't come to h5, obviously, because of our rook. So maybe they come here and try to be pretty aggressive with their queen. But then we just play pawn to d6, solidify our pawn chain, opening up for a light square bishop to attack the queen. It's not going to go well. They could even just try to push the queen down even more to try a trap of their own and just play queen to f7. We're not going to fall for that because we're masters at the Lucchini Gambit. When we play queen to e7, stopping that threat, and then they just don't have anything else to do. The other option they could look at is after the pawn takes here on h5, they could even play c3, knowing that they want to get their queen out on the queen side of the board and not the king side, because it's not doing too much. But then we just play queen to g5, attacking this pawn here on g2. Very difficult for them to hold on to this position. Maybe queen to f3, trying to stop this. But then pawn to d6, preparing to get the bishop here to g4. Just not a lot of good things going for white. So that is what happens if your opponent is going to be playing the most common move, which I think, and that is the knight to g5. The next variation we are going to look at is if the bishop takes here on g8. I don't think this is very common, but I do want to give some other iterations in case your opponent does not go with what we think they will do. Now, we are going to take their bishop here. So sure, yeah, if you want to exchange your bishop for our knight, that's completely fine. They could now play knight to g5, which makes a ton of sense. Now, the best move really is to play g6 in this position, setting a trap, because maybe they look at this and say, wow, that pawn there is free to take. But then we can play the move queen to h4. And this is almost forcing for us to take this knight here on h7, because this is checkmate if they try to hold on to this knight, which they can't really. But the threat is the queen takes here on f2, checkmate. And so they are going to lose this knight here on h7. So instead, they should not take that. But another option you have, and this is just the beauty of this opening, is you have so many different options, and your opponent can really fall into tons of traps regardless of where you go. Another option you have is queen to f6. And this could bait them to get their queen out involved into the game. Queen to h5 check. We're pretty much forced to play g6 here, attacking the queen. So the queen really has to move here, and they may think that they can take this pawn here on h7, but very similar to the knight. If you come down here, this is a poison pawn. You can't just take that pawn, because we're going to come and take something as well. And we're going to play rook to h8, and the queen is going to fall. There's no way for them to hold on to it. So that's what's going to happen if they play bishop takes here on g8, and one variation that you could see. Another variation is castling on the king side. I think this is probably the safest of the plays from white. We're just going to play knight to f6. You could try just to exchange material right here, but I think after you do this, you're pretty much forced to play knight to f6, and I just don't think it's as good, because now they have the move knight to g5, and it's pretty annoying to deal with, I think, in this position. Instead, I think it's much better if we don't take that material and instead play knight to f6 here. And now, if they played knight to g5, we can play queen to e7. And now if they come down here with their knight, because they may say, okay, this is protected, so I'm going to attack this rook here. Well, we could just play rook to f8, and you can see they really haven't made any ground up, and this is not going to be good for them. So you've pretty much stopped their threats of actually coming down to f7, and this is going to be just all fine for black. So that is an overview of the Lucchini Gambit. Hopefully you guys have a better idea of how you should be playing, or potentially should be playing after they play the move pawn to d3. If you ever run into this, have the opportunity to play it, I highly recommend it. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, if you have other videos you would like to see, let me know in the comments below. Someone let me know the other day they wanted to see this video, so I made it. So just want everyone to know I do read the comments, and I do try to make all the videos that you request. So let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video, if there's anything else. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.